Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our final session of the day here at HR Exchange Live, Diversity and Inclusion. I hope you've enjoyed the discussions today and are feeling energized around this topic as much as ever. And as you feel engaged, I hope we're all thinking about the future and ways organizations. But as we do that, there's a lot to consider. And I hope that this session, titled Creating Equity, Why Intentionality is Key, is going to give us all a lot more valuable food for thought. As always, put your questions for our speakers in the chat function underneath the chat tab, and any technical questions that you might have, I just ask that you put those under the help tab in the chat function, and we'll do the best that we can to help you sort those issues out as quickly as possible so we can get you back on track. We are joined for this session by Patty Dingle. She is the head of diversity and inclusion at BNY Mellon. Welcome, Patty.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the promotion. I'm the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the Americas, so not quite there overall yet. But thanks, I'll take it, right? But
Well,
thanks for
I'll let your
having
boss
me.
know. And
Yeah, right. Let's just make that happen. But thank you for having me. I know we connected recently, and really you provided this opportunity. I thought, what a great way to share with folks what I've been doing at BNY Mellon over the last 10 months. I started during COVID in September, the day after Labor Day. I have a joke. I always tell people I have no idea how tall they are because we're all just sitting in our chairs, virtual platforms. But I will say that my role is fairly new with the organization. We have someone in EMEA, obviously my boss, the chief diversity officer. We have someone in India, and we have a lot of support staff. And I mean a lot. I mean in total, like 7 people, which is not a lot for a 50,000 person organization, which is why I think intentionality is really, really, really key today. So David, if you don't mind, shall we just jump right into it?
yeah, go for it. Tell us a little bit about what
Okay.
you've all been doing.
Yeah. So first, I want to start off with the abstract that David was my thought partner on, and I started with the McKenzie Report. And folks, this is available online. If you look up McKinsey, the Black Experience at Work in charts, the reason why I'm starting with this is because I was very, very purposeful when I first started around what community I would focus on. Obviously, I focused on the Black community. And of course, a lot of it had to do with what happened in the summer, which George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd. But it was also kind of like, finally the opening to drive this work and amplify it. We've been doing this work for a very long time, but this was an opportunity. And regardless of how I felt about it, really had to seize the moment, if you will, right? As we like to say, um, you don't want to miss out on this because you don't want to have any regrets. However, in 2019, the Center for Talent Innovation had come out with a report being Black in corporate America. And so that was pre George Floyd. And then the McKenzie report came out. And altogether, it not only validated everything that I had been trying to do, but it validated in a way where I can really be focused on the Black community. And I'll talk about how we went after it intentionally. But a little bit more about the McKinsey study. It was 24 companies representing about 3.7 million US employees, so pretty decent size. I always ask the question, when George Floyd happened and all these companies were making commitments and donating money, and I fast forward to, a year later, what's really changed, right? How are we measuring success? And I'm going to talk a little bit about a lot of the little wins we have every day. And David and I were literally talking about how there's this idea that we want to be perfect all the time, but we have to define like what is good enough. And I think for any business solution, it takes intentionality and patience. Results won't happen overnight. And so we're going to dialogue about this. So I'm just going to share upfront some of the things we're doing at BNY Mellon, and then I'd love for it to be just a two-way dialogue. David and I will bounce some things off of each other. I'll probably ask a few questions of you, and then we can go from there. So the key takeaways: understanding why reflecting on the past helps us create inclusion today. We're going to talk about that, and how to mitigate the feeling of exclusion. People are becoming a little bit louder and louder about what about me. and that realize although diversity includes everyone, not every dimension is created equal. And that last one that I mentioned really resonates with me because, when I've been in this space for about 18 years, and I always think about, well, what about this community or what about that community? And we all know this, right? We just need to practice it more. Is that when you are intentional about the community that is the most marginalized, all boats will rise. And that's what I like to say, which is another reason why I focused on the Black community. I had support from those two studies that I mentioned. I had the data, I had the research, and now I had to find out like what's going on internally, right? And so after looking at data, because data is always important, I think about data as you hook people with the data, you reel them in, and you have really intense conversation on what that all means. Data is an indicator, and then we have to shape the narrative. And you know what? Like most companies, representation of Black talent is low. It's the lowest. And we share some of our data externally, so I can be very upfront with you on this. And also this idea of senior leadership. So we talked about that too. And the representation at senior leadership is not quite there either. We have two Black women on our executive committee, our head of HR and our head of audit, which is pretty good. We do pretty good when it comes to our board of directors, 33% ethnic minorities, 3 are Black, 1 is Hispanic, Latino, Latinx. And I want to put all those together because I don't know how they identify. So we have 4 really key areas of focus. Like most companies, it's acquiring the talent, it's recruiting the talent, it's the education awareness, it's the retention and development. And I added one that I call connecting community. And listen, recruiting, acquiring talent, what are some of the traditional things we think about? And maybe David, this is maybe where I might bounce around a little bit. In the chat, I'd love for you all to talk about what are some of the traditional ways you go after Black talent? I can probably guess what the answers would be, but go ahead and put in that chat there, and maybe I could put.
There we go.
Oh,
Oh,
and
someone asked, was it HBCU recruitment? And I expected that.
me too, right? Me too.
Hmm.
And Black students, Black talent trending right now. And this
Mm-hmm.
trend is not going away, right? So of course HBCUs, right? And so but everyone's going after that, right? Everyone's there. And it doesn't you can't just show up with the table and a tablecloth. You have to deepen the relationships with the HBCUs. And we have someone on our talent acquisition team that is really running with that and moving with that. My question is the intentionality behind that and what else should we be doing? So, yes, we're doing HBCUs, but one thing we're being super intentional about is we're identifying people within the firm that are HBCU grads that are part of the Divine Nine. And guess what? Anytime we try to recruit or acquire someone from an HBCU, we create a correlation between those potential candidates and the people we have internally, right? Because there's nothing better than talking to someone at the firm who's trying to recruit you that has had a similar experience to you, right? If you're coming out of Howard, I'm finding that Howard person inside of BNY Mellon and I'm connecting them. And that person that's inside is talking about what it's like to work here, right? What do they get out of that? What it has their experience been? And add on top of that, if they were part of a Divine Nine, even better. And then think about the affinity that people have internally with those external. We can go as far as sports. We can go as far as any type of social organization. So gathering that information from our employees, either through our employee resource groups, our Black Leadership Forum, our Latinx Leadership Forum, our Asian Leadership Forum, we're able to create this database of additional people that, frankly, can help us seal the deal, right? And it's one of those little extras and the intentionality behind it that I think can really differentiate, some of the work we're doing around acquiring and recruiting talent. Now, I will also share job descriptions. We've all heard this. There's masculine language There's feminine language. We are being super intentional about what type of language we're using in job descriptions. We're a 267-year-old firm, a bank, not customer facing except for on the wealth management side. And I see, I, I'm not kidding, folks. I saw a job description the other day where it said, strong written communication skills and oral skills. I was like, what? I haven't heard that word since 1985, maybe, but like verbal skills, right? Um, and so being intentional about the language you use in job descriptions is another thing we're doing. And look, there's tools out there that will help you do that. And one really quick story I'll share with you is that while at another company, we had part of our operations group had roles that were 24/7, right? It's the data network and all these other things. And what we realized was that working with some tools, 24/7 is not necessarily um, for women something that they're interested in doing because it's like, oh my goodness, what does that mean for me, right? And I took 24/7 out of a job description, and the amount of women that applied within 6 months went up 30%. But we use a tool to help us understand that. So job description for acquiring talent. Now, I want to talk about education and awareness. I don't know about you all, but I think I've heard over and over and over again that companies are pushing people or encouraging people to have these courageous conversations. Have the conversation. Absolutely. But are we helping our folks have the conversation, particularly those that are part of the majority? When I came on board, there was a lot of fear of saying the wrong thing. The heart was there, right? But they were just really worried about, making others uncomfortable. And, we say, well, you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Yeah, we say all these words all the time. But what are we doing intentionally to help people do that? And so one of the things that I realized is that we had folks from the Black community that were very comfortable um, sharing their stories in front of large groups. But these were the same people over and over and over. And I knew that we had more there. So I decided to create another channel for folks to share their stories in a very private way. And I can't take full credit for this, but again, at a former company, I remember we were about to move to a state where our Pride employee group did not feel was inclusive of their community, and actually maybe even quite dangerous. And this was years ago. And what we did was we took their stories and we literally bound them in a book as to their coming out stories or why, they would not feel safe in that environment. So I took that and I went to our Black employees and I said, hey, listen, I would love it if you all could share your stories in writing. Share it in writing. You could be anonymous. You could put your name on it. Totally up to you. But what we did was we ended up sharing that with every single people manager in the company. And it did a couple of things. It did a couple of things. As a manager, someone could sit there and read those stories privately by themselves, right? Not in front of a big group of people. We asked them to pay attention to their visceral reactions, but our goal was to help them build a stronger empathy muscle. And for our employees, for those of you that are writers, know that when you write, it's a sense of relief, right? It is a way to kind of share without that vulnerability of being in front of people, being put on the spot. The one Black employee, hey, can you share your story? None of that. And what resulted in that was really powerful, where people have seen a shift in the way these conversations are being conducted. And so there's that empathy piece. And again, it was intentional. We asked a very specific group of people. We had a very specific objective, and we were very intentional about who we wanted to read these stories, and we pushed it out. And now, whenever anyone wants to have further dialogue, I ask them to read these stories first. So that's about like kind of awareness. David, did you want to jump in?
I just was going to say I love that. Obviously I am a writer, but I think that this is something that I do in my personal life as well, whether it's my friends, my colleagues, my family. if there is a confrontation, that writing about it rather than speaking, you tapped into an inner monologue that
Mhm,
is hard to access when you're trying to communicate verbally, because
mhm,
you're so worried about what you're saying, or you're
mhm.
worried about how am I coming off. Whereas when you're writing, you can be a little bit more transparent and just yourself, and really dig into your story, whatever the story is about, in a different way. So I love that
Yeah.
approach. I think that that's really a healthy way, both for the person sharing and the person reading, because like you said, the person reading it, they're digesting it in a different way. I think
Mhm.
that's a great idea, and something that I would say should be replicated.
Well, and we're going to do that for our other communities within the firm too, because it was what I would consider successful just based on the feedback received. And it was valued. I felt like it was really valued, right? The approach. And the last thing I'll mention around awareness, look, folks, I think we've done a lot. Pardon me. We've had conversations. We brought in Robin DiAngelo to talk about white fragility, her book. I moderated a conversation with the legal team around the book. So you want to talk about race, or from Ijomo. I think her last name is Oluo, I believe. If I'm not, hopefully I'm pronouncing it correctly. And that's fine, right? I mean, you could do that all day long. And we were having these webinars, bringing in external people, and I just felt like they were good, but they weren't getting to the core of what I needed to happen. And so back to that other key takeaway around understanding the past, um, so you could realize why things are happening today. And I literally took that and I said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to give a history lesson, because for those of you, um, well, even I'll speak for myself, my generation, history in school was, I learned nothing about slavery. I was brought up in the schoolhouse rock days, so I can I can recite, the Constitution because it was a song, but I knew nothing about my history, my father's history as a Black man. And the only way I learned was through storytelling, whether he would tell me, and fortunately, during his time when he was dealing with dementia, I learned way more about my family history than ever before, but it was through other relatives, right? So, having said that, I knew that what Black people were talking about today and using words like chattel and things like that, I'm like, do people even know what that is? So I said, okay, we're going to deep dive with slavery. And um, it was not rated, PG. It was pretty intense. Well, maybe it was PG, not PG-13 though, because it showed images. It was the real deal, the real story. And the person that we had come in to facilitate this, had a vast historical knowledge of her family. She considers herself a storyteller, not a historian, though. But she was able to weave in her family history with kind of what she was sharing in this webinar. And ultimately, again, the goal was to help people understand history and to understand why reactions were the reactions that we were experiencing today, etc. Now, that was also part of the reason why I did it, because I was also hearing the buzz that happened so long ago. You all may have heard that. I'd love to maybe see some responses. If you've heard that before, put a yes. If you haven't, put a no in the chat. Um, it happened so long ago, Patty, right? And I'm always up for a coachable moment. And I say, well, I appreciate that. And let's think about systems today. Let's think about, yeah, women were given the right to vote in what, 1920, but Black women couldn't vote. They couldn't vote until 1965, 2 years before I was born. So we connected the dots with some of our folks that are in that generation X. I like to say excellent because that's my generation, or even boomers, right? We have people that are less than 2 degrees from us that either knew someone in their family who was a slave or were part of civil rights or what have you. So it is so close to today. And so we did a deep dive on slavery, then we did a deep dive on Jim Crow, the real deal, folks. Like showing the images, showing, little white kids holding up signs about they don't want their schools being integrated, right? It really painful stuff. And the reason why I'm saying that is because we also knew that for our Black employees, it would cause a lot of trauma. And so immediately after those sessions, we would have um, a little bit of a therapy session for our Black employees. So again, intentionality about what we're going to take a deep dive into to help people understand and be aware. And the last one I did, because my company is based on the East Coast and I sit in California. The last one I did was about redlining and freeway construction. So for those of you who are in New York or East Coast, um, you could literally open the door and it's right there, right? You could grab onto it, you could see it, the way the freeways were constructed, where they were constructed, how that even happened. And then explaining redlining, people get that, right? And I will ask you a question, and I've always asked this a question. I always ask this question in front of groups. Have you ever referred to a neighborhood as a bad neighborhood?
Yeah, I
Most
think
people, yeah, right?
most people are guilty of that at some point, and they may have a different definition of what that means.
Yeah,
But
and guilty is kind of a interesting word, right? Because
hmm,
depending on what that means, right? Are
yeah,
you saying that because the whole neighborhood is made up of Black families, or the other side of the tracks? We would say that too, or don't go to the South Side, right?
yeah,
But I want you to think about who what community was living there, you know?
hmm
What community was made up the South Side, right? That was done, that didn't just happen. And I shared I live in the Bay Area, and people say, "Oh, melting pot." It's not a melting pot. There's a reason why we have Chinatown and Japantown, birds of a feather flock together. Absolutely. But I just talked to someone 6 months ago, and she's an attorney. She's Chinese American, and she just bought a house, and she reads the fine print, and in the fine print it said, "Do not sell to Chinese." They had a whole list. So it wasn't just Black people; it was everyone but white people, right? But the fact that that was still on the books and no one even took the time to
to
even look at
notice.
that, right? To notice this. But I asked that question. So the person who delivered our redlining session, Dr. Julian Hayter, that was my question. I was like, well, why wouldn't people notice that? And he's like, it's just everywhere. It's everywhere.
Hmm
Like you would
It,
have to literally comb through everything,
it's one of
right?
the ways that something systemic can also be covered up in a way, is that it's just so common that it's
Yeah.
almost like it's just, you can't, it's hard to even see it because it's just so right in front of you, and it almost seems natural.
Right.
But
Right. And it's, you're pushing paper, you're going through, stacks of documents. Like let's think about this. In just June of last year, or was it this year? I'm sorry, I'm getting no, it was last year. Okay, last year. You know, up until that point, you could still be fired in 28 states in the United States for being gay, lesbian, that just passed. Like, come on. But the thing is, would anyone do that? I'm not sure if they would do it like out in the open, shouting from the mountaintop, but it was still on the books, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right?
no, the fact that it
Um,
exists.
the fact that it exists, lynching laws, we're having that conversation today. The Crown Act about how you wear your hair, and you being fired for wearing your hair a certain way. And for the Black community, that's sacred stuff, right? So 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 let me talk. So I talked about education awareness. Now I want to talk about retention and development. So around the retention side, most of us, our companies do engagement surveys. Some of us may even do stay interviews. polls, surveys, things like that. We were very intentional, again, about seeking out feedback from our top performing Black talent. And we use Ninebox, like a lot of companies, but also talent that others kind of like were like, you got to keep an eye on these folks. They're like up and coming. They're on their way to do great things. Okay, we did what's called engagement interviews. This is nothing new. They're very similar to stay interviews, but the goal of these interviews is for us to have a resignation preparedness plan if someone were to ever say they wanted to resign. So, in other words, we were asking them questions like, what would tempt you to leave? Are you having development conversations with your manager? Um, do you feel like you have career growth opportunities here? And based on all of that, I would go, me, one on one with their business partner, and we would correlate the information. Now, this took a ton of time, but it was worth it in the end because now we should not be taken by surprise if any one of those folks decides they want to leave. We should have a plan in place because what do we do when someone resigns? We go, wait a minute, give me a couple of days. Let me get back to you. And then you go try to figure something out and come up with a role. Whereas with these engagement interviews, we have enough evidence as far as what they want, what would keep them here. And we share that with the business partner, we share that with the manager, and then you put a plan in place. So again, this kind of resignation preparedness plan, no one should be taken by surprise if someone chooses to leave the company. Now, there's healthy turnover too. If someone were to leave for something bigger that we just could not offer, that's a whole other story, because they're probably leaving your organization speaking very highly of you, right?
Hmm.
So that's healthy turnover. Um, and I think the last one I want to talk about, I'm looking at my notes here, the culture and connecting. The one thing that we also discovered, that I discovered, the team, is that we have employees, 50,000, all over the United States. Like most organizations, the representation is usually in levels that are, well, in financial services, VP is in the middle, right? And our folks just didn't know who our executives were, right? We have all of these phenomenal Black managing directors, all of these amazing Black directors. And we realized that folks just didn't know who they were. So I literally created something called the Black Excellence at BNY Mellon community meeting. I invited every single person that identifies as Black to this meeting just to get a download on who the Black executives, who they are, what they do, what function they're in, because oh man, that person's in HR. I'm gonna reach out to them. I gave them a DEI download, what everything we're doing, about our representation goals. You can imagine there's thousands of people on the call, so it could only be one-way dialogue. But we decided that in between these community meetings, which take place every quarter, we are going to do smaller roundtable discussions around topics where people really want to know or really want to learn more. So let's say career trajectory, right? We'll conduct a small roundtable. We'll have someone from talent and development. We'll have a business partner, and we'll have someone from the Black Leadership Forum to kind of help share about their personal journey at the firm. So connecting people, creating that community was really important for us. And again, the intentionality behind it, we were very clear that it was just going to be for Black employees. As a matter of fact, even our technical crew were Black employees because we wanted to create that safe space. And then we'll continue to do this quarter after quarter. And it's a blueprint for other communities. It's a literal cut and paste for other communities, right? As I start to now think about our Latinx community and what that means for them. Um, sorry, I lied. I got one more thing. I talked about trauma earlier. We have great resources through our EAP programs. Listen, if someone were to call and say, I need help, I'd like a Black therapist, I think that people will jump through hoops to make that happen. But for me, that just wasn't enough. So I am bringing in someone who specializes in trauma for the Black community, and we're going to have not a one and done. We're going to have a series of sessions for people because mental health is critical right now. COVID, working from home, managing kids, managing older parents, um, high stress job, society, all these things going on. I think the least we can do is provide some sort of assistance around mental health. So I'm bringing in someone that will look like the community, that lives in the community, that is an expert in this space, a clinician, to really walk us through this so that we can take advantage of a little bit of self-care. So David, I ran on a lot, but I want to
It's all
pause
right.
there. Maybe we can have a little bit of a banter. Maybe people have questions.
Yeah, I have a couple, and certainly, audience,
Yeah.
please plug in or go in the chat and put in your own questions. But you've brought up the word trauma a couple of times, and I
Yeah.
think it's a really important thing to talk about. You mentioned there about when people say it was a long time ago. You talked about that earlier. One of the things I think is interesting about that is this idea that like it's isolated to that time or a generation, but
Right.
the people who lived in that time raised children and made impressions on them the same way that anybody's parents make impressions on them,
Yes.
and their parents and their parent, and it just goes on, and you keep making these impressions, but it's people who have been steeped in some severe trauma making impressions on generation after generation. I think that's something that gets lost in this idea, like, well, it was so long ago, as if
Hmm.
we can heal without actually going through a healing process. Like just time will heal all wounds, but not necessarily in this case.
No. And these people are working with us, right? Like we
Yeah.
are those people. And I think, first of all, language matters too. So people are still not even saying black. They're saying underrepresented. Now there's this term BIPOC. I'm like, I get it, but stop piling us in, to these larger communities. We have to focus on the Black community. It the research shows it, the data shows it. The most marginalized group, again, all boats will rise, right? And I think if we're not saying Black explicitly, and we could say African American too, but just be mindful that it depends on how people. Black is kind of a more inclusive term. That's why we say it. And just to be safe, sometimes I'll say African American Black. But I think we even have to start saying the words, right? Um, Lynching, murder, killing. That's hard, but they're it's painful. It's super painful. So I hear you. And listen, at the end of the day, in the workplace, it's about behavior and maybe less about opinions. You
Yeah.
know, I I'm not sure if I can change your opinion, but I need to make sure that your behavior is not representative of that opinion if it's, one that's going to marginalize anyone. Yeah.
It's funny you bring up the language there. You mentioned BIPOC and Black, and it almost feels like sometimes we just invent new terms as a way to sort of dilute things. It's almost like I think about the how many times has the term shell shocked been remade over the years, right? From war terminology, right? It's now today it's called PTSD, but it's had several different names down the years, and it's just a different way of describing the same thing, but because they didn't like,
Right.
maybe someone said it didn't sound right or whatever. I find it more, we should focus more on the experience and what it means and to the people involved, and rather than necessarily how it makes someone feel, or whether or not it makes anyone uncomfortable, I should say.
What is
um
it? What is the saying? You can't put lipstick on a pig, right? So, it and it's also like, you know, let's think about the disability community, right? Disabled community and, handicapped and no, handy capable and then disabled person. I think language evolves for sure, but it's like we got to really the problems don't go away.
no,
You
just
got
because
to
we
deal with
relabeled
that.
it.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
got to deal with that, right? So, yeah.
You mentioned, or we're having this conversation about trauma. It's is guilt a form of trauma? Because I think one of the things that happens is a lot of people feel this guilt, but
Mhm.
I'm curious, is that sort of like about, because guilt as an emotion is a very strange thing. It's hard to deal with.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering, you mentioned you brought in Robin DiAngelo. She talked about white fragility. And I know some of the critics of that book have said, it was almost like an exercise in guilt.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and,
She, you know
and
what?
so,
She addressed that,
yeah,
and she says, y- guilt. You should feel responsible, right? Because that's the return. It's like feeling guilty is almost like being jealous. What's the purpose of it, right? And what does it serve? Um, and so this idea that you may be in a position to make change or to break down systems, et cetera, that's where you should feel like you have some responsibility, right? Because her whole thing is like, we could validate the guilt, but what is that going to do, right? And there's this overuse of ally. Like, if I hear ally one more time, right, I'm just kind of like, because, and then we heard performative allyship. We started hearing that. We started hearing woke washing, all these things. So I was like, okay, you all need to be active allies. I've heard co-disruptor. I've heard accomplish. You have, because it's actionable, right? So guilt is not an action. If you feel responsible, then you can take action with that. So she addressed that right on. And my thing, if you're feeling guilty, then that's a different conversation. And it also may come like you may not be in a position where you can influence or have some power, but you know what? You got to figure out what you can do, right? It's calling. My former sister-in-law texts all the time. She's like, Patty, I bought everybody the book. She's a Caucasian woman. She lives in like Owasso, Michigan, right? I bought everybody the book, and I'm so frustrated with this and that. And I was like, wow, you're doing a lot. So she's being responsible, right? Going out, but then um, she feels guilty. She wants to do more and more and more. I was like, no, you can't feel guilty. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's
yeah, it can't
loaded,
be.
David. Yeah, it's loaded.
Yeah, it can't be just you can't put it all on yourself either.
You
It has to
can't.
be
You can't.
you build in a community essentially of like-minded people in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and we
Um,
have to decide like when we tend to push a lot of people, and some people aren't worth pushing. We have to
hmm.
we have to we have to pick our battles basically. Yeah.
One of the things I hear a lot in HR is we talk a lot about getting people to come to work as they're the best, all of themselves, bring all of themselves to work, bring their
Yes.
best selves to work, all of this. For people in Black, Latinx communities, what does that mean exactly? Because I think we talk, I've had conversations in the past with colleagues about things like code switching
Yeah.
and, can you even bring your whole self to work when you feel like you have to do that? You know what I mean?
Uh, yeah. So, okay. I think we as individuals, we know that we have a lot of authentic selves, right?
That's
Like
true.
the Patty you see with family and friends may not be showing up on Monday for work, right? Um, listen, I think covering, code switching, all those things um, are tiring. They take time away from the work sometimes. Think about the LGBTQ community, and we would have these conversations years ago about switching the pronouns of your partner on Monday because listen, Sunday is probably the most segregated day of the week and Monday is the most integrated. And, what do you do on Monday? What'd you do over the weekend? Right? Um, but I think it for the Black community in particular, it's everything from hair to clothing to vernacular to possibly accent to um, even colorism. I think, listen, I've had to come out as Black more than I ever have in the last year and a half. I'm half Black, right? Um, because, and I'll share a personal story that growing up, and listen, I looked at my old third grade picture, like the class picture with all the little squares, and everyone was a shade of brown except for the two little blonde kids in the corner with the very pale skin. And I was like, wow, I grew up in a very diverse area. It was very military influence, and all of us were most of us were half this or half that, right? We were what the government calls us as two or more, right? And and I found myself changing my vernacular when I would be with a Black community versus maybe the Asian community because I'm half Japanese. So there was always this internal identity struggle with me. So can you imagine the amount of just energy it takes to do that?
Yeah.
Right? It's exhausting. Or even the Black community going, "Oh, you have that good hair." And how would that make me feel? No, my it's how you take care of your hair. I would always try to fight these battles. So I was like, "Well, how can I get my hair to be more like that?" Right? Wanting to fit in, assimilate instead of integrate myself, into these communities that I feel I should be I should belong there. I am you, right?
Yeah.
But I'm so different, like visually. So this idea of covering, I just had a conversation with someone who's from the Caribbean and wants to wear a head wrap to work. I'm like, wear your head wrap. She's like, I'm worried about what people are going to think. So we manage that dimension of diversity of ourselves based on what we think how people are going to perceive us, right? I work for an East Coast company now. I show up in a jacket, right? Whereas, if I was working still for a West Coast company, I might have a hoodie on right now. Very conscious of that. My dad never wore jeans in his life. He dressed up every time he left that house because he didn't want anyone to see him as less than. So again, oh, and you know what? This broke my heart. I had someone ask me for an accent neutralization class. They
Mm.
wanted to get rid of their accent. So this idea of different being deficient is just it's heartbreaking, right? And as much as I tried to convince them not to do that, they really wanted to do that. Why? Because they were trying to grow in the company and they felt like that was the only way that they could do it. And this is not here. This is at a former company. But the fact that they asked for that was pretty heartbreaking. David, I know I kind of went a little bit
No,
roundabout
no.
with that response,
Okay.
but authentic self, we have to be very careful when we say that. Do we really mean it? One, right? Listen, I worked everywhere from insurance to tech to now financial services. I've seen the engineer in the cargo shorts and the Birkenstocks, and I've seen the three-piece suits, right? Both of those folks were rock stars at their job, right? And so, but we judge people. And so, we're not being ourselves if we show up a little bit different. And one thing I'll just say is that, folks, think about when someone has ever said to you, "Hey, you're not yourself today." What does that really mean? No, it is myself. It's just a different version of me, especially those of us that are maybe more introverted versus extroverted, and all of a sudden you're showing up a different way. So I think we need to be careful with that authenticity comment.
I think that particular comment is something that does not recognize the fact that it's a human being on the other side of it,
Right.
because
We're
you're,
complex.
yeah, I might be having just an awful day, or maybe something's happened with my family. Like, it's just, you have to recognize that, like, I'm not going to show up the same every day. My face isn't going to look the same every day. And I'm not going to bring the same intensity to a meeting every time you have one. And that's
Mhm,
just kind of how it is. It's because I'm a
mhm.
person. That's really all.
It's pretty simple. Like, I am a human being, right,
But
that
it's funny
has
the
feelings.
expectations, that we put on other people.
Right, right,
Um,
right, right, right.
Patty, I want to thank you for this conversation. As
Oh
I
my
knew
God,
this
is
was
it
going to
time
be
yet? Oh my
yeah,
goodness.
we're
Okay.
we have about 20 seconds. So
Jeez.
no, I knew it was going to fly, but I also knew this was going to be a good conversation, a different conversation than probably any
Yeah.
of the others that we would have today. And so I want to thank you for helping me facilitate that.
David, you're welcome. And, of course, anytime. I just want to offer to folks, if you want to connect, let's connect. This is one of the things about this diversity work. We share, right? We're all trying to do the same thing. So I don't know who's on the call right now, but if we're part of maybe the CDO peer exchange or anything else, let's connect, because I think together we'll be able to make progress a little bit faster than not. So thank you again, David. I appreciate it. All the best to everyone. And hey, I might as well say it. It's only Tuesday, but I'm not going to talk to y'all for the rest of the week. So have a great weekend.
Excellent. Well,
All right.
everybody, thank you for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation and all the others. I know I did, and I know it gives us a lot of food for thought. So I'm happy that you could join us, and be sure to keep an eye on us. We've got more live events coming up. We've got another one in September focused on corporate learning, and more to come after that. So be sure to keep an eye on the HR Exchange Network, and do check out our podcasts. I talk a little bit about D&I on there. We've had some use the Ask the Editor. You can send me an email at editor@hrexchangenetwork.com if you have any questions. I like to just do a little bit of research when people ask me these questions and then kind of weigh in on it. But we've had some that came in on D&I stuff, and I've attempted to kind of answer those in the past. And it's been interesting, a good experience for myself as well as I kind of explore these topics. So selfishly, I'm asking you to help me. But anyways, thank you for joining us today. Hope to see you next time. And until then, stay safe.